Hey, everyone. I don't even know how to start this. My hands are shaking as I type. I guess I just need to get it out, and maybe someone out there will know what to do, or at least tell me I'm not going crazy. It all started about 2 months ago. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had just celebrated our 2-year anniversary. I wanted to do something nice for her, so I decided to grab some flowers on my way back from work. You know, just a small, sweet gesture. There's this little flower shop a few blocks from my apartment in Brooklyn. It's tucked between a boarded-up laundromat and a deli that's seen better days. I'd walked past it a million times but never thought much of it. The shop's window was a foggy mess, streaked with dirt, and you could barely see inside. The sign above the door just said, "Flowers," in faded green paint, and a small bell jingled when I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Not the fresh, floral scent you'd expect, but something musty, like wet leaves and old paper. The shop was cramped. Buckets of flowers, some vibrant and others wilted, crowded the floor. The walls were lined with shelves holding dusty vases and old trinkets. It was like stepping into someone's attic. Behind the counter stood an old woman. She was tiny, barely 5 feet, with wispy white hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, man, her eyes were something else. They were this washed-out blue, like old glass, and they didn't quite focus on me when I walked in. "Looking for something special?" she asked, her voice soft but scratchy, like an old record. Yeah, I managed. "Just some flowers for my girlfriend." She didn't say anything. Just nodded and started picking stems from different buckets. Her movements were slow but deliberate. She chose flowers I didn't recognize, deep purples, dull whites, some with petals that curled at the edges. I thought about asking if she had any roses, but something about her made me hold my tongue. She wrapped the bouquet in brown paper, tied it with a thin piece of twine, and handed it to me. Her fingers brushed mine, and they were ice cold. 75 cents, she said. I blinked. I mean, I didn't expect Manhattan prices, but that was nothing. I fished a crumpled dollar bill out of my pocket and handed it to her. She didn't give me change, just smiled, a thin, stretched smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Take care now," she murmured. I left the shop feeling uneasy, but I shook it off. It was just an old lady with a weird vibe, right? When I got home, Sarah loved the flowers. She put them in a glass vase on our kitchen table, right by the window where the afternoon sun could hit them. But the next morning, they were completely dead. I mean, not just wilted, brown, brittle, almost decayed. It didn't make sense. Sarah joked about my black thumb and how I couldn't keep a cactus alive. I laughed it off, but something nagged at me. Those flowers had been fresh when I brought them home. I told myself I'd just gotten a bad bunch. I didn't think much of the old lady after that. At least, not until I saw her again. It was about a week later. I was on the M14 bus heading downtown, earbuds in, zoning out as the city rolled by. And there she was, sitting a few rows ahead of me. Same messy bun, same thin frame. But this time, she had a huge black backpack on her lap, stuffed so full it was almost bursting. She didn't notice me. She just stared straight ahead, lips moving like she was talking to herself. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to follow her. When she got off at East Houston, I did too. She walked slowly, her small feet shuffling against the pavement. I kept my distance, pretending to check my phone every few steps. She led me through narrow streets, past graffiti-covered walls and broken fire hydrants. The air smelled like hot garbage and street food. Eventually, we reached the cemetery. It wasn't one of those well-kept, touristy cemeteries. This place was old, with crumbling headstones and patches of dirt where grass refused to grow. The old woman slipped through a wrought iron gate. I hesitated, but curiosity pulled me forward. I ducked behind a low stone wall and watched her. She moved through the graves with practiced ease, like she knew exactly where she was going. And then she started stealing flowers. She'd crouch low, her bony fingers yanking bouquets out of the ground. Bright lilies, somber chrysanthemums, even plastic arrangements, all of them stuffed into her backpack. She worked quickly, almost frantically, glancing around every few minutes. I should have left. I know that now. But I stayed. I watched as her backpack filled up, as the cemetery's color faded under her hands. And then, when she'd gathered enough, she stood by a grave, one of the oldest, its name worn away by rain and time. She started to sing. Her voice was soft, a low hum that drifted through the still air. The melody didn't make sense. It wasn't a song, not really, just a string of sounds that didn't quite fit together. And then she began to shake. Her body trembled, her knees buckled, and she dropped to the ground. It was like watching someone have a seizure, but slower, almost controlled. I wanted to run to her, to help, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, but fear pinned me in place. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her dress, and walked away. Not a limp, not a stumble, just calm, steady steps. I stayed hidden until she was gone. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. I waited until I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore before I stumbled back to the bus stop, my mind reeling. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her shaking body, heard that awful song. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. I tried to push it out of my mind. Told myself it was just an old lady, maybe with dementia or some kind of mental illness. New York's full of people who seem strange if you look at them too long. But I couldn't shake the image of her standing by that grave, that unsettling hum in the air, and the way her body had convulsed like she was being pulled by invisible strings. The next morning, I dragged myself into work. I'm an assistant manager at a hardware store, nothing fancy, but enough to pay the bills. I spent the whole shift in a fog, half-heartedly stocking shelves and helping customers, while my brain replayed everything I'd seen. When I got home, Sarah was curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her. She looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, slipping off my shoes. She nodded, but I could see the effort it took. "Just feeling off. Headache, maybe the flu." I brought her tea, made her soup. Tried to be there for her, but my mind kept drifting back to that flower shop. The next few days were a blur. Sarah's health went downhill fast. What started as a headache turned into fevers, chills, a deep, hacking cough. I took her to the doctor, but they couldn't pin it down. They ran tests, gave her fluids, but nothing helped. I called her mom, let her family know what was going on. They lived in Vermont, a good 5-hour drive away. Her mom was planning to come down if things got worse. The hospital admitted her a week later. She was so weak she could barely keep her eyes open. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, whispering that everything would be okay. But I didn't believe it. One evening, as I sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of cold coffee, I remembered the flowers. The way they'd withered overnight, how Sarah had started getting sick not long after. I told myself it was ridiculous, but a sliver of doubt wormed its way into my mind. I needed answers. The next morning, I skipped work. I rode the M14 bus for hours, hoping to see that old woman again. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I stayed. And just when I thought it was a waste of time, I saw her. Same old woman, same black backpack bulging at the seams. She got off at the cemetery again, and I followed, keeping farther back this time. The routine was the same. She moved through the cemetery, plucking flowers from graves, stuffing them into her bag. But this time, I wasn't paralyzed by fear. I crept closer, using the gravestones for cover, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. When she started singing, I hit record. The screen trembled as I filmed her. The strange melody drifted through the air, each note making my skin prickle. And then, just like before, she fell. Her body convulsed, her head lolled back, and for a moment, I thought she was dead. But then she moved. Not slowly, not shakily, but fast. She shot to her feet, her head snapping to the side as if she'd heard something. Her glassy eyes locked onto me, and my blood turned to ice. She shouldn't have seen me. I was at least 30 feet away, crouched behind an old stone angel whose face had worn away. But her stare drilled into me, sharp and unblinking. And then she ran. Not a shuffle, not the slow gait of an old woman, but a full-on sprint. Her arms pumped, her feet pounded the earth, and her mouth opened wide, a scream pouring out that didn't sound human. She called my name. David. Her voice tore through the cemetery, high-pitched and distorted, as if a dozen voices were layered over her own. She screamed my name again and again, each syllable hitting me like a hammer. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a half-sunken gravestone. My phone slipped from my hand, bouncing off the ground, the recording still running. David. You are cursed. Your family is cursed. My breath came in ragged gasps. I turned and ran, my legs barely holding me up. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear her, the heavy thud of her feet, the guttural sounds that scraped from her throat. I burst through the cemetery gate and out onto the street. Cars rushed by, horns blaring. I stumbled into the crosswalk, a cab skidding to a halt inches from me. The driver leaned on his horn, his face twisted in anger, but I didn't stop. I ran until my chest burned, until my vision blurred. I collapsed onto a bench outside a bodega, my hands clutching at the wooden slats. When I finally looked back, she was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind a storm of fear and confusion. I knew I couldn't go to the police. What would I say? That an old woman was stealing flowers and chasing me through a cemetery? They'd laugh me out of the station, or worse, lock me up. Instead, I went home. Bolted the door, drew the curtains, and curled up on the couch. I checked my phone, somehow, it was still recording. The video was dark and shaky, but you could hear it. Her voice, the sound of her feet on the dirt, and my own panicked breaths. I played it over and over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there was none. Just madness caught on tape. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with her. Those pale blue eyes, that twisted scream, and the flowers, always the flowers, wilting in fast motion, petals crumbling to dust. When I woke up, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to find out more. I had to go back to that flower shop. The next morning, I barely ate. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty vase where those cursed flowers had once stood. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows on the walls. It felt like the world outside was normal, like people were just going about their lives, while mine was spiraling into something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone, the recording still queued up, and shoved it into my jacket pocket. The video was my only proof, though I wasn't sure of what. I'd watched it again before I left, her twisted run, the way she screamed my name. The audio was garbled, but you could still hear that inhuman edge to her voice. I walked to the flower shop. The streets were busy, the rhythm of city life almost soothing. I passed a couple arguing outside a cafe, a dog pulling its owner down the sidewalk, and a street vendor setting up his cart. It all felt so normal. But then I turned the corner, and there it was, the same foggy window, the same peeling sign that just said, flowers. My stomach nodded. The bell above the door gave a weak jingle when I stepped inside. The smell hit me again, that damp, rotting scent. It was like stepping into a room that hadn't seen daylight in years. The old woman was behind the counter, just like before. She wore the same faded dress, her hair still twisted into that loose bun. But there was something different about her. She looked fresher. Her skin seemed less pale, her posture straighter. When she saw me, her lips curled into that thin, unsettling smile. "Back again?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost sweet. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I wanted to get more flowers." Her eyes narrowed, just a fraction. "For your girlfriend?" A chill ran through me. I hadn't told her that before. Or had I? My mind raced, trying to remember every word I'd said during my last visit. "Yeah," I forced out. "She's still in the hospital." Her smile widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in her eyes. How unfortunate. She moved around the counter, her small frame slipping between the crowded displays. She picked up a bouquet, lilies, roses, and those same strange, curled petal flowers. "These should do nicely," she said, holding them out to me. I didn't take them. My hands stayed at my sides, clenched into fists. "Where do you get your flowers?" Her expression didn't change. "Oh, here and there. I'm always finding treasures." I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket. "Like at the cemetery?" Her face remained calm, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. "You shouldn't say such things," she murmured. "It's bad luck." I took a step back. My heel knocked into a metal bucket, sending it clattering to the floor. She didn't flinch. "Are you cursing people?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She tilted her head, bird-like. "Curses only touch those who deserve them." My breath hitched. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She seemed so small, so fragile, but I could feel something radiating from her, a heaviness, a pressure that made my skin crawl. "I need to go," I muttered, turning toward the door. "Take care now, David." I froze. I hadn't told her my name. My pulse thundered in my ears. I yanked the door open and stumbled outside. The fresh air hit me like a slap. I kept walking, my feet carrying me away from that place as fast as they could. I didn't stop until I reached a crowded intersection. The light was red, a stream of cars cutting off my path. I doubled over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. People moved around me, their faces blurred, their voices a dull roar. When I finally straightened up, I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the video, but I couldn't bring myself to watch it again. Instead, I opened my camera app, switched it to video mode, and hit record. I panned the camera over the street, the passing cars, the bustling crowd. I needed proof. Real proof. My phone buzzed, Sarah's mom. My heart sank. I knew what she was going to say before I even answered. "David?" Her voice was thick, like she'd been crying. "Sarah, she's not doing well. You need to come." I didn't remember the train ride to the hospital. The world outside the windows smeared into a blur of gray and steel. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed and pale. When I got to the hospital, Sarah's mom was in the hallway, clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee. Her face crumpled when she saw me, and she pulled me into a hug. I held her, my arms stiff, my body numb. Inside the room, Sarah lay in the bed, tubes and wires snaking over her frail body. Machines beeped softly, a steady, indifferent rhythm. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked. She looked so small under the thin hospital blanket. I sat by her side, took her hand. It was cold. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." She didn't respond. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. A nurse came in, checked her vitals, and slipped back out. She didn't say anything to me. No one did. Hours passed. Maybe days. I couldn't tell. The world narrowed to the soft beep of the machines and the weight of Sarah's hand in mine. When her breathing stopped, I didn't move. Not until the nurse came back, her face set in that practiced, gentle mask. She touched my shoulder, and I pulled away. I left the hospital in a daze. The city outside seemed wrong, like a movie set with the sound turned off. I wandered through the streets, my feet carrying me nowhere. When I finally looked up, I was at the bus stop. The M14 pulled up, its doors hissing open. I got on. And there she was. The old woman. Sitting in the back, her black backpack on her lap. She looked at me, and I knew this wasn't over that I didn't take my eyes off her. She sat in the last row, framed by the dirty window, the city's gray blur behind her. Her expression was calm, almost serene, like a grandmother on her way to church. The black backpack sat on her lap, the zipper stretched tight over what I knew had to be more stolen flowers. I stayed near the front of the bus, gripping the metal pole so hard my knuckles turned white. The other passengers were lost in their own worlds, headphones in, eyes glued to their phones. I was alone in this. We rode in silence for nearly 20 minutes. The bus jerked to a stop every few blocks, but she didn't move. I watched her reflection in the window, waiting for any sign of recognition. But she just stared forward, her lips moving in a silent rhythm. Praying? Chanting? I couldn't tell. Finally, near the edge of town, she stood. My stomach flipped. She pulled the cord, and the bus lurched to a stop. She moved with that same unsettling grace, her small frame cutting through the crowded aisle without touching a single person. I followed. My feet felt disconnected from my body, like I was floating a few inches above the ground. The bus pulled away behind me, leaving a cloud of exhaust that hung in the cold air. The cemetery loomed ahead. It was older than the one I'd seen her in before. The iron gates were rusted, the stone pillars crumbling at the edges. The kind of place that the city had forgotten. She moved through the gate, her backpack bouncing slightly with each step. I hung back, ducking behind a line of hedges. My phone was already recording, the camera peeking over the edge of the leaves. She did it again. The flower theft, the wandering between headstones, her hands nimble and practiced as she plucked blooms from graves. But this time, I noticed something else, her lips were moving, that same whispering chant from the bus. It was constant, unbroken, like she wasn't even breathing. And then, just like before, she stopped. She stood before a grave, her body stiff, and then the shaking began. Her head lolled back, her spine arched, and a low, wet sound crawled out of her throat. I edged closer, my phone held tight in both hands. The camera zoomed in, the screen showing every twitch of her face, every spasm of her fingers. Then, without warning, she dropped to her knees. Her bag spilled open, flowers tumbled out, their petals dark and damp as if they'd already begun to rot. She started to sing. The melody was wrong, notes that didn't belong together, a rhythm that slipped and stuttered. I felt it in my teeth, a dull ache that spread through my skull. And then she went still. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. Her lips were blue, her skin stretched tight over sharp bones. I thought she was dead. But then, with a jolt, she sprang to life. Her head snapped toward me, her neck bending at a sickening angle. Her eyes locked onto mine, and my phone slipped from my hands, landing in the dirt. David. Her voice was a rasp, 1,000 voices tangled together, each syllable crawling over my skin. I couldn't move. I was pinned under her gaze, my muscles locked in place. She rose to her feet, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. You are cursed. Your family is cursed. The earth rejects you. She took a step forward. Her feet didn't make a sound on the gravel path. The flowers wither. The blood sours. The bones ache. I forced my legs to move. I stumbled back, my heel catching on a half-buried root. I hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of my lungs. She was on me in seconds. Her fingers wrapped around my ankle, ice-cold and impossibly strong. She dragged me across the dirt, my jacket catching on thorns and broken stones. I kicked out, my foot connecting with her chest. She didn't make a sound, but her grip loosened, and I scrambled to my feet. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, the wind roared in my ears. I could hear her behind me, the wet slap of her feet against the ground, her voice following me like smoke. David! You cannot escape. The roots are in your blood. The gate was ahead. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my vision tunneling. I crashed through, nearly tripping over the uneven sidewalk. The street was empty. The cemetery backed onto an industrial area, shuttered warehouses, loading docks, chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. I ran toward the main road. My feet pounded the pavement, each step sending a jolt up my spine. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached the busy street, I nearly collapsed. Cars rushed by, their headlights harsh in the early evening gloom. I stumbled into the light, the rush of traffic and the blare of horns pulling me back to reality. I turned. The cemetery gate stood open, its rusted iron twisted and broken. But she was gone. I sank to my knees, my chest heaving. People stared as they walked by, but no one stopped. No one asked if I was okay. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking. The screen was cracked, dirt smeared across the lens, but the video was still there. I hit play, and the sound of her voice poured out of the tiny speaker, tinny and warped. Proof. I had proof. But as I watched, the video began to distort. The image twisted, colors bleeding together, and her voice morphed into a low, guttural growl. The screen went black, and then my phone died. I sat there on the cold concrete, the city moving around me, and felt the last thread of hope slip away. This wasn't over. Not yet that I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those pale eyes, that twisted grin. My apartment felt claustrophobic. Shadows clung to the corners, every creak of the old pipes sounded like whispers. I sat on the edge of my bed, my back against the cold wall, my phone plugged in and lifeless on the nightstand. The battery had been fine before the cemetery. Now, it wouldn't turn on, no matter what I did. The only proof I had was gone. At some point, I must have drifted off. When I opened my eyes, it was dawn. A sickly gray light seeped through the window. My neck ached, my body felt heavy, and a damp chill hung in the room. I forced myself to get up. The bathroom mirror showed a stranger, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, stubble shadowing my jaw, skin pale and slick with sweat. I splashed water on my face, but it did nothing to shake the fog in my head. I needed answers. My laptop sat on the kitchen table, still open to the last page I'd been reading, curses, folklore and fact. I'd gone down the rabbit hole after my first encounter with the old woman, desperate to find anything that could explain what I'd seen. Back then, it had seemed ridiculous. Now, it felt like my only option. I typed in every combination of words I could think of: flower thief cemetery, old woman curse, strange chanting in graveyard. But nothing useful came up, just ghost stories, urban legends, a handful of conspiracy blogs written by people who seemed even more unhinged than I felt. Then I found it. A thread buried in a forgotten forum, the kind that hadn't been updated in years. The title stopped me cold. The Flower Witch of Greenhill Cemetery. My hands trembled as I clicked. The post was old, dated back almost 15 years. A user with the handle Gravewatcher87 had written a long, rambling story about an old woman they'd seen at a cemetery in the city. She'd been stealing flowers from graves, wandering the headstones, and singing in a strange language. The user described the same spasms, the same feverish chanting. But there was more. Others had responded. A woman whose dog had fallen ill after sniffing flowers left on her doorstep. A man whose wife had died suddenly after they'd bought a bouquet from a shop that sounded eerily similar to the one I'd visited. The stories varied, but the pattern was clear. She always appeared in the outskirts of the city, usually after a major loss, a fire, a flood, a wave of illnesses. She seemed to feed off grief, pulling flowers from the graves of the newly buried and selling them to the living. The thread ended abruptly. The last post was from Gravewatcher 87, just a single line. She knows my name. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and stumbled into the hallway. The apartment building was quiet, most of my neighbors already off to work. I pushed through the front door and into the biting cold of the morning. I didn't have a plan. My feet moved on their own, carrying me through the city streets, past crowded bus stops and shuttered storefronts. I found myself at the bus stop again, the same one where I'd first seen her with that black backpack. The M14 pulled up, its doors hissing open. I hesitated, then stepped on. The bus was nearly empty. I sat at the front, my fingers gripping the edge of the seat. The city rolled by, gray and washed out, the buildings draped in mist. My breath fogged the window. Half an hour passed. The bus wound through the industrial district, past the cemetery where she had chased me. My muscles tensed, but I didn't move. I needed to see her. I needed to end this. We reached the last stop, a place I'd never been before. The bus driver, a middle-aged man with a weary face, turned to me. "End of the line, buddy." I nodded, my body moving automatically as I stepped off the bus. The neighborhood was desolate. Rows of boarded-up houses, weeds growing through cracked sidewalks, the echo of my footsteps too loud in the empty street. I turned a corner, and there it was. Her shop. The window was still fogged, the sign still peeling. But the door was shut, a closed sign hanging in the window. I pressed my face to the glass, but the inside was dark. The flowers, usually crammed into every available space, were gone. Empty vases lined the shelves. The place felt abandoned. A prickle ran down my spine. She wasn't here. I stepped back, my breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. She could be anywhere. She could be watching me right now. My phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it. Somehow, it had turned on. The screen lit up, the battery at 1%. A message. From an unknown number. "You can't hide, David." My stomach dropped. I stumbled back onto the street, my eyes darting to every shadow, every alley. The city seemed to shift around me, buildings leaning in, windows staring. And then, from somewhere nearby, I heard it. That song. Her voice. The melody twisted through the air, soft and sickly sweet. It wrapped around me, pulled me forward. I walked without meaning to, my legs stiff, my feet dragging against the pavement. There, at the edge of the alley, I saw her. Her back was to me, her shoulders hunched. She was pulling flowers from a makeshift shrine, candles, framed photos, wilted bouquets left on the curb. The kind of memorial you see after a tragedy. She turned. Her face was wrong, stretched too tight, her mouth too wide. Her eyes were black, the whites swallowed by dark veins. "David," she said, her voice sliding over my name like oil. "You shouldn't have come." I couldn't breathe. My phone slipped from my fingers, shattering on the concrete. She took a step toward me. And I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. The city blurred around me, shadows and lights smearing into a twisted painting. My body moved on autopilot, my mind looping through every horrible image, her face, her eyes, the sound of her voice scraping against my name. Somehow, I ended up back at my apartment. I slammed the door behind me, through every lock, every bolt. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I slid down the door, my knees pulled to my chest. My phone was gone, smashed on the sidewalk where I'd dropped it. I had nothing, no proof, no plan, nothing but a gnawing dread that crawled under my skin. For hours, I sat there. The world outside moved on, oblivious. Neighbors shuffled past in the hallway, doors opened and closed, cars honked on the street below. Life continued, normal and indifferent. But I wasn't part of it. I was caught in a loop, my mind dragging me back to that alley, to the sight of her hunched over those flowers. My girlfriend's face flashed in my mind, Emily, lying in that hospital bed, her skin waxy, her breathing shallow. She'd looked like a wilting flower, drained of life. When the sun set, I finally moved. I pulled myself up, my muscles stiff, my body aching. I needed to do something, anything, to break the spell of that day. I decided to go back to her shop. It was the only lead I had left. I told myself that if I could find something, anything, that made sense, maybe I could start to feel normal again. The streets were empty when I left. The air was sharp, biting at my skin. I walked with my hands shoved deep in my pockets, my shoulders hunched against the cold. When I reached the shop, my heart sank. It was still closed, the door locked, the windows dark. I tried the handle anyway. It rattled but didn't budge. I pressed my face to the glass, squinting into the dim interior. Nothing. Just those empty vases, the faint outline of dust where flowers had once been. She was gone. A dull, hollow ache settled in my chest. I stood there, staring, my breath fogging the glass. I didn't know what I had expected, maybe to see her there, maybe to confront her, to demand an explanation. Maybe I thought I could break whatever hold she had over me by sheer force of will. But there was nothing. Just the cold and the dark. I wandered back into the night. My feet took me to the hospital without thinking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. The nurses at the front desk barely glanced at me. I knew my way to Emily's room by heart. But when I got there, the bed was empty. The sheets were stripped, the machines gone. Her name had been wiped from the whiteboard on the wall. A nurse found me standing in the doorway. Her expression was soft, sympathetic. She spoke, but I barely heard her. Emily had died that morning. Complications. Her body had simply given up. I nodded, numb. I don't remember how I got home. The days that followed were a blur. People came and went. Friends, family, faces I couldn't quite place. They spoke to me, but their words drifted by, weightless and meaningless. I couldn't stop thinking about that old woman. The way she had run at me, the way her voice had twisted around my name. The smell of those flowers, sour and wet, like rot. I saw her everywhere. In the corner of my eye, in the shadows of my apartment, in the faces of strangers on the bus. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My body wasted away, my skin clinging to sharp bones. One morning, I woke up and couldn't recognize my own reflection. I looked like a ghost, pale, hollow, my eyes sunken and rimmed with shadows. Her words echoed in my head, "You and your whole family are cursed." I knew what I had to do. I started taking the bus every day. The same route, at the same time. I sat in the same seat, my hands clenched tight in my lap, my eyes scanning every passenger. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter melted into spring, and still, I rode the bus, waiting. But she never came back. Her shop stayed closed. I checked it every day, peering through the window, looking for any sign of life. Eventually, the city boarded it up, and the glass fogged over with dust. And still, The curse sat in my chest, heavy and cold. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, if this is all some horrible delusion, or if she's still out there, watching me, waiting. I'm writing this because I need help. I need to know if anyone else has seen her, if anyone else feels the same weight dragging them down. Maybe I am cursed. Maybe she took something from me, something I can never get back. Please, if you've seen her, if you've heard her, tell me. I don't want to disappear like the others. I just want my life back.